Okay, ready to go deep?
Always. Let's do it.
Today we're tackling a topic that's on every pet parent's mind at some point, right? Spaying and neutering. I mean, it seems like a pretty standard part of having a dog or cat.
Yeah, you take your pet to the vet, then it's just one of those things you do, or at least that's how it seems, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you sent over some research that suggests it's way more nuanced than just checking a box on a form.
Yeah.
Like when you spay or neuter, your pet could have a bigger impact on their long-term health than we thought.
It's true. And spaying or neutering definitely helps control the pet population, which is super important. But these studies you shared really get into how the timing could actually lead to some health issues down the road.
And to be clear, we're diving into 3 different studies here, each looking at this issue from a different angle. We've got one from Portugal that focuses on shelter dogs and cats, another one, a huge 21-year study from UC Davis that looks at specific dog breeds, and then this really interesting one from the UK that used a totally different approach to try to isolate cause and effect.
It's like having all these different pieces of a puzzle, right? And each study gives us a piece of this bigger picture. So by looking at all of them together, we get a much more complete view of how spaying and neutering, specifically the timing of it, can actually affect a dog's health in the long run.
Okay, so let's jump right in with that Portuguese study because they had this finding that honestly made me do a double take.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
They found that medium-sized dogs, and this is regardless of what it is they're neutered, but medium-sized dogs were over 14 times more likely to become obese than dogs who weren't neutered.
Wow. 14 times.
14.57 to be exact.
Yeah, that's a huge difference. I mean, I know it's just one study, but still.
Right, exactly. And it really highlights how important it is to actually talk to your vet about this.
Right.
Like, this isn't just a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. It's a decision you should be making with your vet, thinking about your individual dog.
Absolutely. This isn't simply about population control, right? We're talking about things that could affect their health for their whole lives. And it is a good reminder that this study was done on shelter dogs specifically. So what they find might be different for, dogs living in homes with families.
That's a really good point. It makes you wonder if the age when a dog is neutered affects different breeds in different ways.
It does. And that's actually what's so interesting about that UC Davis study, because that's exactly what they wanted to find out.
They went all in for this one, didn't they?
They did. 21 years of data.
On 5 specific large dog breeds.
I know. It's incredible. German short-haired pointers, mastiffs, Newfoundlands, Rhodesian Ridgebacks, and Siberian Huskies.
So basically, if you love big dogs, this study is for you.
Yeah, and what makes it so valuable is they were really looking at those specific things that tend to be problems for bigger breeds, like joint problems and cancer, right?
Huge issues for large breed dog owners. So what did they find?
Well, this is where it gets interesting, especially for people with those big dogs.
Lay it on me.
They found that if you neuter these dogs early on, before they turn 1, it was linked to a way higher risk of them having joint problems later. And this was true for all 5 breeds.
Wait, so for all of them, across the board?
Across the board. Pretty compelling, right? It really shows that there's something going on here.
Wow. So if I'm hearing you correctly, if you've got one of those breeds like a German short-haired pointer or a mastiff, you definitely need to read this study.
Yeah.
What about the cancer risks? Did they see any connection there with when the dogs were neutered?
Yeah, so with the cancer, it's tricky because it wasn't as straightforward. Like, for instance, they found that for male mastiffs, getting neutered early actually made them less likely to get lymphoma, which is a type of cancer. But then for female mastiffs, getting neutered early meant a much higher chance of getting mast cell tumors.
Oh, wow. It's like totally different depending on the sex of the dog, even within the same breed.
Exactly. It shows you how complicated this whole thing is.
So it seems like the cancer risk is kind of a toss-up depending on the breed and whether you have a male or female. What's the bottom line for listeners who have one of these big dog breeds? Like, what should they be thinking about?
Well, I think the biggest thing is if you do have a German short-haired pointer, a mastiff, a Newfoundland, a Rhodesian Ridgeback, or a Siberian Husky, you really need to take a look at this UC Davis study. It just shows how important it is to have that conversation with your vet, right? Like, weigh the good and the bad and really consider the health risks for your specific breed.
It's like you really need to be informed before making that decision. Okay, so we've talked about joint problems, cancer. What about urinary incontinence? That's another big one, especially for female dogs. A lot of our listeners ask about that.
Oh, for sure. And that's where that UK study comes in. They were specifically looking at how the age a female dog is spayed affects whether or not she develops urinary incontinence later on.
Okay, and they use this really interesting method, right? Like target trial emulation.
Yeah, have you heard of that before?
I have, but honestly, it sounds super complicated. Can you break it down for me and for our listeners who might not be scientists?
Totally. Imagine you have a time machine, right? And you could go back in time and set up the perfect experiment to figure out a specific thing. That's basically what they're doing with this target trial emulation. They're taking data that already exists and using it to mimic a totally controlled experiment.
So it's like they're rewinding time to get a clearer picture of what's really going on. That's so cool.
Right. Super clever.
So what did they find out about spaying and urinary incontinence with this time machine method?
Well, they found that if you wait a little bit to spay a female dog, like between 7 and 18 months, it actually lowers the risk of them developing incontinence early on compared to spaying them before 7 months.
Interesting. So it's
Yep.
like maybe waiting a bit longer could be better in that case, at least when it comes to that particular issue.
Could be. It's definitely a conversation to have with your vet, especially if you have a female dog and you're concerned about incontinence.
It seems like each of these studies is like a piece of the puzzle, right? They're all saying that spaying and neutering is way more complex than we used to think.
Totally. It's not just as simple as yes or no, spay or don't spay. There are so many factors to think about. And the main thing is that spaying and neutering are great for controlling the pet population, but they might also have unintended consequences that we're only starting to understand now.
It's like we're trying to find that balance,
Yeah.
right? Where we're preventing one set of problems without accidentally causing others. And that balance point might be different for every dog, depending on their breed, how old they are, if they're male or female, even just their lifestyle.
100%. And remember how we were talking about the Portuguese study and how they only looked at shelter dogs?
Yeah.
That's really important to keep in mind because those dogs probably don't have the same kind of health history or genetics as dogs who live in homes with families.
Right, like their background is totally different.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that every study has limitations, so you can't just look at one study and make a decision. You have to look at everything together to get the full picture.
Speaking of the full picture, we've talked a lot about purebreds. But what about all those mixed breed dogs out there? Do these findings apply to them too? I know a lot of our listeners have adorable mutts at home.
You're so right. We have to talk about the mixed breeds. And the good news is that the UC Davis researchers actually did a follow-up study just to see what's going on with them.
Okay, I'm ready for the mixed breed scoop. What did they find?
Well, they look at a ton of data on mixed breed dogs, and they divided them up into 5 groups based on how much they weighed. And what they found is kind of what you'd expect the best age to neuter a mixed breed dog, at least if you're just thinking about health risks, seems to depend on their size.
So bigger dog, wait longer.
You got it. For those bigger mixed breeds, the ones over 40 pounds, if you delay neutering it, it seems like it could lower the risk of them getting certain cancers, like those mast cell tumors, and also some joint problems, like cranial cruciate ligament rupture, which we talked about earlier.
That totally lines up with what they found with the purebreds. Seems like size really does matter when you're trying to decide when to spay or neuter. What about the smaller mixed breeds? What did the study say about them?
That's where it gets a little less clear. For the smaller dogs, under 40 pounds, they didn't find that same strong connection between neutering age and those health problems.
Does that mean it doesn't matter when you neuter smaller mixed breeds?
Not necessarily. Just because they didn't find that same strong link in the data doesn't mean it's not a factor at all. There could be other things going on, like maybe there are certain breeds within those weight groups that are more likely to have problems, but it got lost in the overall data because the groups were so big.
So it's still kind of a mystery for the smaller mixed breeds.
A little bit, yeah. It seems like genetics are definitely playing a role, but with mixed breeds, you never know exactly what you're going to get, right? So it's harder to say for sure how those genes will affect how they react to being neutered.
Right, because it's like a whole mix of DNA.
Exactly. And that's why, going back to what we were saying before, having that open communication with your vet is just so crucial. They can look at your dog's history, what breeds might be in the mix, their lifestyle, and give you more specific advice.
It's like being a detective, right? You and your vet working together to figure out what's best for your dog.
I like that. Pet detectives.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Portuguese study, UC Davis, the UK study. But there's one more piece of research you sent over that I wanted to make sure we talk about. It's the one that looks at the connection between spaying or neutering, obesity, and even those wellness plans that some vets offer.
You mean the one that looked at Banfield Pet Hospital?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the one. It seemed really interesting, but also kind of surprising at first glance. Like, They found that dogs who were part of these wellness plans were actually more likely to be overweight.
That does seem counterintuitive at first.
Right. You would think that if they're going to the vet more regularly and getting more personalized care, they would be healthier, not less healthy.
Right. But it's important to remember that just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one caused the other.
Correlation doesn't equal causation, as they say.
Exactly. And in this case, the researchers actually thought that the reason those dogs were more likely to be overweight was that they were just getting weighed more often because they were going to the vet more.
Oh, so it's not that they were actually gaining weight because they were on the plan. It's just that their weight was getting tracked more.
That's what they think, yeah. It's a good reminder that even when you're talking about scientific research, there can be these other things that affect the results that you might not expect. But I think the main takeaway here is still that there does seem to be a link between getting spayed or neutered and gaining weight.
Right, because we know that being overweight can lead to a ton of other problems for dogs.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the biggest health concerns for dogs, right up there with everything else we've been talking about. It can cause joint problems, heart problems, diabetes, even some types of cancer. And this study, like the others, found that dogs who had been spayed or neutered were much more likely to be overweight.
So does that mean we should be freaking out? Like, is this a guarantee that if you spay or neuter your dog, they're going to become obese?
I don't think so. It's not that straightforward. This study was mainly focused on figuring out if there was a link, not proving that spaying or neutering directly causes weight gain. So it's definitely something to be aware of, but it's not like a guaranteed outcome.
Okay, so it's more like a possibility than a certainty.
Hmm.
Are there other things that might contribute to weight gain after spaying or neutering?
Well, think about it. When a dog is spayed or neutered, their metabolism actually slows down a bit.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So if their diet and exercise stay the same, all those extra calories they were burning before, they're not burning them anymore.
It's like us after the holidays, right? If we don't adjust what we're eating after all that delicious food, we're going to gain weight.
Exactly. So it's not that spaying or neutering flips a switch and your dog suddenly can't control their weight. It's more about being aware that there might be this change in how their body processes food.
So the key is being proactive, right? Like, if you know this might happen, you can work with your vet to make sure your dog stays at a healthy weight.
You got it. It doesn't have to be this big, scary thing. There are things you can do, like maybe you adjust their diet a little, switch to a food that's made for dogs who have been spayed or neutered, or maybe you just add in some extra walks or playtime to help them burn more energy. It's about working with your vet to figure out what makes sense for your dog.
It just goes to show you how something that seems as simple as spaying or neutering can have all these other effects on our pet's health. It's way more than just preventing puppies.
I know. It's amazing how much we're still learning about it, even though it's something vets have been doing forever.
Right. And it sounds like that's why it's so important to talk to your vet, because they're going to be the ones who can keep up with all the new research and help you make the best decision for your dog.
100%. It's about having those open conversations and realizing that it's not just a one-time decision. It's something you should be thinking about throughout your dog's life.
Totally. And speaking of new research and things changing, there's one more thing we need to talk about today.
Yeah.
All these new alternatives to spaying and neutering that are popping up. Have you heard about these?
Oh, yeah. It's like a whole new frontier in pet reproductive health. It's pretty fascinating, actually.
Tell me everything. What are we
Yeah.
talking about here?
Well, spaying and neutering, the way we've always done it, are still the most common ways to sterilize pets, obviously. But now we're seeing all these new options that are less invasive, and some of them are even reversible.
Wait, reversible, like you can undo it.
Exactly, that's the idea. Anyway, it's still pretty new, but that's kind of the holy grail, right? Being able to prevent unwanted pregnancies, but also maybe preserve some of the good things that come with having those hormones around.
It sounds kind of like science fiction.
A little bit, yeah. But it's exciting. Like for male dogs, there's this procedure called a vasectomy.
Wait, like for humans?
Yep. Same idea. They just block the tubes that carry the sperm, but they leave the testicles where they are. That way, the dog's body is still producing testosterone and all those other hormones, but he can't actually get a female dog pregnant.
So it's like you get the best of both worlds. No puppies, but also no worries about hormonal side effects.
Potentially, yeah. And then for female dogs, they're starting to do something called an ovarian sparing spay.
Okay, break that down for me. What is that?
So basically, they take out the uterus, but they leave the ovaries, which is where the hormones are made.
So the dog still has her cycle and everything, but she can't actually get pregnant.
You got it. Pretty cool, right?
It is really cool. It seems like a great option for people who are on the fence about spaying or neutering because of those hormonal changes.
Exactly.
I'm guessing these new procedures aren't without their own downsides, right?
Right, of course. Like with anything in medicine, there are always going to be risks and benefits to weigh. And one of the big things is that these techniques are still pretty new, so we don't have a ton of data on how well they work long term or what the side effects might be down the road.
So it's kind of uncharted territory in a way.
Kinda, yeah. We're still figuring it all out. And it's also important to remember that these procedures tend to be more expensive than traditional spaying and neutering.
Oh, right, because they're more specialized, I guess.
Exactly. So that's something else to keep in mind, depending on your budget.
It seems like we're entering a whole new world when it comes to spaying and neutering. It's amazing to think about all the options that might be available in a few years.
I know, it's really exciting. But it also makes the role of a good vet even more important, don't you think?
Well, absolutely. It's a lot to keep track of, and it seems like the research is changing all the time.
Totally. And that's why having a vet you trust, who can help you understand all the options and make the best decision for your individual dog, is priceless.
It's like instead of just one option, now you have all these different factors to consider, different paths you can take.
Right. It's about figuring out what makes the most sense for you and your dog.
Exactly. And for most people, that means having a really good vet, someone they can talk to about all of this and get advice that's tailored to their dog.
Totally. And that's one of the things I really like about these new alternatives. It encourages people to have those conversations. Because even if you're not interested in those procedures, just knowing they exist might make you think differently about the whole spaying and neutering decision.
It's like it opens up the conversation.
Right. Exactly. And I think that's a good thing because for so long it's just been this automatic thing you do. But now we're starting to realize it's way more complicated than that.
It really is. And it sounds like from all the research we've looked at, the biggest takeaway is that there's no right answer for every dog.
Totally agree. It depends on the breed, the individual dog, what you want for your dog, all of it.
It's like the more we learn, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
100%. And that can be frustrating, but it's also exciting because it means there's always more to learn, always new possibilities.
That's a great way to look at it. So to wrap things up for our listeners, what's the one thing you hope they take away from our deep dive today?
Honestly, I just hope it makes them think, like really think about this decision and not just go with what they've always been told or what everyone else is doing. Do your research, talk to your vet, and figure out what feels right for you and your furry best friend.
Perfectly said. And on that note, we'll leave it there for today. A huge thank you to all of you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and ever-evolving world of spaying and neutering.